All right, well, I'm actually impressed with the turnout for this room for the last session. It's D.C., you know, 2 o'clock. They say if you don't get out of D.C. by 2 o'clock, you'll be stuck here till after dinner. So thank you for our policy warriors here that stayed on for this last conversation. I'm delighted to be joined by two phenomenal Hunt Cain Fellows and Lieutenant Governors from Kentucky and Indiana. This session hopefully will put a bow on the topics and the conversations you all have been a party to this afternoon. I'm going to start with Governor Jacqueline Coleman, who's the Lieutenant Governor from Kentucky, and then we'll invite Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch into the conversation. Governor Coleman, just to get us going, you're a former teacher. You still talk about your time in the classroom. Actually, we were just talking about AI and how our lives would have been a lot easier 15 years ago. But as a leader in your state, how did you guys go about setting your education agenda?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for being here for the best conversation of the day. I was a high school teacher. I was actually an assistant principal when Governor Beshear asked me to run with him. And so my life was spent in the classroom, and I have to give a lot of credit to Governor Beshear. He was smart enough to pick a teacher as his running mate. Education is one of the biggest issues we face and talk about. It's the biggest piece of the budget. And so having someone who's walked in those shoes, who can speak for the folks who are doing the work every day was critically important. But it's also important to note that he listens. I'm not a token. I wasn't there to win an election and then move on. With every education decision that's made, from policy to appointments, he and I brainstorm together and we talk through all of those issues. And so what I would say is one of the best things that we do to elevate the conversation around education is we listen to the people who do the work every day. So oftentimes we get policymakers together and folks who maybe care about the issue but haven't walked in those shoes, trying to make policy for the people who do the work every day, and that's a mistake. Making sure that everybody has a seat at the table, and there are a lot of stakeholders. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, as we go on. But we ultimately have a three-pronged test that we use for every education decision that we make. Number one, does it put kids first? If it doesn't, we're not for it. That's number one always. Number two is what we often miss. Does it support the people who show up for our kids every day? Because those folks are carrying the burden of communities, the burden of education, the burden of readying a workforce for the next generation. They have to have support too. And last but not least, and this may sound like rocket science, but I promise it's not, does it provide the resources for our schools to do what we need them to do, right? So often the resources are here and the expectations are here, and it's not fair to put that kind of a burden to close that gap on the folks in the trenches, right? So if we've got a policy rollout, if we've got something we want to see come to life, we've got to put the resources behind it so that our schools can do what we need them to do. That's truly what guides every decision that Governor Beshear and I make about education in Kentucky.
Great, thank you. Governor Crouch, actually, on our prep call, we were talking about what are the questions we want to talk about, and I had a bunch of pretty good questions, and she was like, I really want to talk about mental health.
Oh, yeah.
It was like emphatic, and so I'm going to come right out of the gate with this because this is one that I was clear that she was very passionate about. But given the past few years, we've been grappling with coming out of this pandemic, all the instructional loss or learning loss, however you want to talk about it. There's been talk of mental health, but not enough talk about it. And clearly, I failed you in showing up for this prep call. Tell me why this is an important issue and how you all have been leading on this front in Indiana.
Absolutely. You know, I always say there were bad things that came from COVID, and then there were some good things that came from COVID. One of the bad things is we all went through a mental health crisis. One of the good things is we all went through a mental health crisis. And so as a result, there's more awareness and there's less stigma and a sense of urgency to do something about it. And I think it truly impacts our young people. You know, when you think that the majority of your brain forms from the age of birth to 5 years of age, so we had children that were born during COVID, children that were in college during COVID, and their ability to be able to deal with the increased anxiety and depression is manifesting itself and will continue to do so for 20 years. You know, since COVID, we've seen a 20% increase and anxiety and depression among our population. But we've seen a 60% increase among our young people. And suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people. In fact, earlier this month in Indiana, a 10-year-old boy took his life. And so this is a mental health crisis that we have, not just in our state, but in every state. And so I became aware and became more engaged when COVID was taking place. And I grew up in a family that really dealt with a lot of mental illness and addiction. My mother struggled with anxiety and depression. My older brother was an alcoholic and drank himself to death. My younger sister, Nancy, died by suicide. And then our daughter, Courtney, is 16 years sober and bipolar. So I've been and lived with those people that have struggled through no fault of their own. I mean, none of us pick our genes, right? If we did, I'd be different. But, we have to do more to wrap our arms around these people that struggle through no fault of their own. And so what I ended up doing is co-founding the Indiana Mental Health Roundtable. And it's a private-public partnership, mainly private, to be able to engage the private sector to come alongside what the state is doing to fill in the gaps and to enhance what we're doing to help those that struggle. And someone said earlier that the private sector drives progress, and I truly believe it. The private sector drives progress. Government can be a convener, a catalyst, a partner, but we need the private sector to be engaged, to be able to make a difference. And so we are conducting our second Mental Health Roundtable Summit on June 12th in Indiana. It is focused on adolescents and children. And it has speakers like the former Surgeon General Jerome Adams, along with the former Surgeon General Antonio Novallo, who was the first woman and Hispanic Surgeon General, Patrick Kennedy, the former congressman who suffers from bipolar disorder and also is in recovery. Also the chief medical officer for the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute will be there. And so we're focusing on what we can do to help those young people that are struggling with mental illness and addiction. But particularly, how does education step in and help with that? And I know we have our public instruction, superintendent of public instruction, Katie Jenner here. And so she has been extremely engaged and involved in what we do to help those young people. And we have a lot of initiatives in the schools to do that. But we want to bring the private sector alongside to be able to help those young people. It's something that we're all going to have to deal with and address. And we're doing it, but it's going to have to be more. Because it's going to manifest itself for the next 20 years.
Thank you, Governor. And Katie Jenner is one of our Hunt Kane Fellows. It's always good to be with you. Governor Coleman, I'd like you to sort of weigh in on this issue as well, given as we speak, we're graduating thousands and thousands of what we are calling the COVID kids. This is the class that started the pandemic, and they're graduating. What are you all thinking about in regards to mental health supports in Kentucky?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for sharing your story. I think it's really important that we normalize the conversation and that we recognize that this is an epidemic that no one is safe from. You probably, if not dealing with something internally, someone in your family or a friend is dealing with a challenge, and that's okay. Normalizing the conversation is really important. And so what we did in Kentucky, as we were slightly coming out of the pandemic, which, by the way, let me back up. We got sworn into office in December. I had a baby in February, and the pandemic started in March. Do not recommend. But talk about having a COVID baby, right? So as we were ebbing and flowing, and we had the Delta variant, and then we had this, and we're frustrated, and we're isolated, and we're all the things. I knew as a teacher, and my husband is still teaching, that this was going to have a huge impact on young people. So we started the Student Mental Health Initiative in Kentucky. And what we did was we brought together a group of high school students they serve as the advisory counsel to our Commissioner of Education in Kentucky. Katie, if you don't have one of those, you need to get one. They're good. And so we brought them in, and I said, what do we need to do to help you? We need you guys to help us. We need you to be our North Star. So our students came together, and they decided we were going to do action summits in every region of Kentucky. We were going to convene high school students, and we even had some middle school students in every location. Our leaders developed the questions. They planned the breakout sessions. They facilitated the conversations. And then they dove into the data that we captured. And from that, those student leaders crafted policy recommendations that we then took on a little bit of a roadshow to community partners, state agencies, our legislature, and the federal government. Those students and the work that they did, and by the way, my requirement was this needs to be 100% student-led. I kept telling them, I can get you in the door, but this is your conversation to have, and this is your work to do. You are our North Star. And so because of their work, we were able to leverage and bring $40 million worth of federal funding to Kentucky for school-based student mental health services. And so what this does is it allows our colleges and universities to recruit mental health students into their programs, graduate them debt-free, and place them in a high school, middle school in their region to provide school-based mental health services. And it's important for us to make sure that these services are available in schools, because it's been proven that a student is 6 times more likely to access mental health services when it's available at their school. You remove the barrier of transportation, of scheduling, of all of those things, and provide the students with that. And so we're still working on it. We're still going to keep advocating for more funding to meet the need of every child. But that was certainly a big start for us to start to make sure that we continue this conversation and make sure that these resources are available for our kids.
And if I may add,
yeah.
The General Assembly this past session passed a bill requiring every school to develop, or school district to develop a policy regarding cell phone usage in the classroom, with the intent to prohibit, cell phone usage in the classroom during school hours. So each district will be developing their own policy. And, I think that is huge in terms of being able to cut down on distractions and be able to keep children more focused on learning while they are in the classroom. But then the whole cell phone usage, the whole social media and how that affects children's mental health is huge.
It is.
One of our great friends, President Michael Sorrell, he's an HBCU in Texas. He was on Oprah's show recently because he and his wife decided to raise their kids cell phone free, and his teenage son, or emerging teenage son, is pushing back, but they're holding the line because of the concerns with their kids' mental health. Yeah. So we need to hear more stories like that. We need to see policy leaders at the local level and certainly at the state level to be sort of creating structure that will protect teachers so it doesn't become combative, because having been in a classroom, having been a school leader, those are fights that teachers don't want to be fighting.
No.
And those fights are much worse today than they were in our time a few years back.
That's right.
So to both of you, I'll ask both of you this question because we've talked today around school choice, career connectedness, the most recent conversation on artificial intelligence, which is a conversation that we're going to be having more and more in the next coming days and months, certainly. They're speculating billions and billions of dollars are going to be spent on AI infrastructure across districts nationally. How are you all thinking about all these issues, and how do you leverage your office to set your agendas? And Governor Crouch, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, in Indiana, I have constitutional duties and I have statutory duties. So constitutionally, I'm president of the Senate. Statutorily, I'm Secretary of Agriculture. I also head up affordable housing, tourism, and then rural affairs in Indiana. And so education isn't my purview. That's why we have a superintendent of public instruction. But how we have used and how I've used my office to try to impact some of these issues is, as head of the Office of Community and Rural Affairs, my office actually has been the leader of the broadband expansion in Indiana. And so we have focused, and starting in 2019, we started investing money to expand broadband throughout Indiana. And what we discovered is during COVID, we were able to provide grants to those schools and communities, excuse me, that didn't have the hot spots, and their children weren't able to do virtual learning. And then we passed legislation that said, with the grant money that we're going to provide to expand broadband, we will put a priority on those schools and communities and those homes where students are living, so that they're the ones that will be able to be connected first and foremost. Then the other area that my office has been engaged in has been, of course, the mental health and the Indiana Mental Health Roundtable. And not only did we have a summit, which, by the way, you all are invited to. It's only $25 for all that from 7 to 4:30 on June 12th. You can go to mentalhealthroundtable.org and sign up. We'd love to welcome you to Indiana. But we also had a Mental Health Matters Day at the State Fair, where we actually had 10,000 visitors visit our booth to be able to talk about mental health. And then, of course, in Indiana, I testified on behalf of the Senate Enrolled Act No. 1, which was really unusual for a lieutenant governor or a governor to testify on behalf of a bill. But that was the bill that put in place the infrastructure and the funding for our 988 suicide hotline, where today now you can call 988 and you'll be connected to a professional who'll be able to get you help. We have mobile response teams that will be able to be deployed to help those Hoosiers that are struggling.
Do you want to weigh in on?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've done in Kentucky that I'm pretty proud of is we kind of had to have the right trifecta in place to get this done, but we partnered with, I represented the governor's office. We had the head of higher education in Kentucky. It's called the Council on Post-Secondary Education, CPE. And then we had the head of our Department of Education, our commissioner. And the three of us came together and we created what we call the Commonwealth Education Continuum. And it was to tie everything from early childhood education all the way up through the workforce. Because so often, I don't know about your states, but what I see in our state is sometimes we tend to operate in silos. And so all the elementary folks are advocating for this, and all the middle school folks are advocating for this, and college is a whole different ballgame. And we just said, if we don't come together to close these gaps at each of the transition points, then none of us are going to benefit from all the work that we're doing. We should just be doing this together. So the core group of the continuum is made up of policymakers, heads of the private colleges, the public colleges, the Department of Education, Governor's Office. And then we also created working groups in each of the different areas where we brought in parents and business leaders from the private sector and teachers to make sure that the people who were either doing the work or who were going to have to deal with the work that's being done later have a voice in that process too. And so again, convening folks, listening to the people doing the work, and delivering for them through policy, through legislation. That's something that we're really proud of. And again, it's closing those gaps at all those transition points from early childhood education through the workforce to kind of bring that whole system of education together. And instead of competing for, dollars in a budget or this legislation to take priority, we shared our priorities, and we're really able to get a lot of good things done.
Great, thank you. We talked a little bit earlier about civics and what's happening in civics education in our states across the country. How are you all thinking about the preparation of our next generation of adults? For example, Indiana, you all recently passed a law to establish a middle school civic education requirement. Governor Crouch, do you want to talk about how your role in civics?
Yeah, in 2019, the Bar Association, did a study and actually found that Indiana's students, 8th graders, a third of them were not at the level they needed to be just in basic civics education. And so the Bar Association formed a civics education task force that I chaired, and then we ended up getting legislation passed that required in the second semester of 6th grade civics education course to be taught. And it's focused on not just the foundation of government, but the function of government, and then the role of citizens. And then we also increased funding for the We the People program, which actually helps those young people understand about the foundation of our society and our government, and then prepare them to be those future leaders. So, you know, we have we've done a lot of work, but we have a lot of work still to do. Mm-hmm. I think there was a recent survey done where over half of Americans could not name the 3 branches of government. And so we have to be sure that our young people are educated, because that is how we keep our republic.
And some of them are elected to those branches of government.
Yeah.
Not us, not us.
Did you want to weigh in on what's happening in civics?
Sure, I was a civics teacher. That's what I taught before I became an assistant principal and lieutenant governor. And I think it's important to start with the purpose of civics education in general, is to teach kids how to think, not what to think. And I think we have to start with that at the baseline of this conversation. But I will tell you anecdotally, when I started teaching, it was right after, the Great Recession. My high school of 1,100 students had 11 social studies teachers when I was hired. The next year we had 3. And so unfortunately, because of the total lack of resources, what we had to do was say, okay, what do we absolutely have to teach? Because that's all we have room to teach. We were cramming kids in our classrooms. We were just overflowing with desks in our rooms. I saw one new set of textbooks in the 12 years I was in the classroom.
Wow.
Right? And so when the arts and physical education, those are usually the first things to get cut. The next thing is social studies. Mm-hmm. And that's, for so long people thought, oh, what does this matter? You can just Google it, you can look it up. Well, when I was listening to the panel about what's going on college campuses right now, I know my story is anecdotal, but I don't think it's unique. And so when we can't define free speech, when we can't sit with 2 competing thoughts in our head, when we can't develop skills to persuade or to debate or to communicate in a way that allows you to disagree and come back to the table together, I think what you're seeing is the result of that. And so I'm so glad that in Indiana they've done this investment in civics education. In Kentucky, we just passed a bill that passed overwhelmingly in both chambers and was signed by the governor. Just the political makeup of Kentucky. The House and the Senate are supermajority Republican controlled. The governor and I are the only Democrats elected statewide. So it's a little bit of a divide there, but that's a bill that passed overwhelmingly and was signed by the governor. And when I looked at the subjects that were required to be in this civics class for high school students, it's basically the table of contents of a government book. Right? And those are the subjects, the 3 branches of government, the things that you need to know about your government, but also you need to know what to do when you feel like your government's not working for you. That's also a really important key as well. And so civics education, it's the reason I became a teacher. I wanted to help kids understand what I realized so many didn't as I was growing up. And it's great to see it kind of making a little bit of a resurgence. But you got to understand there's a whole, almost a generation of kids who have gone through without adequate civics education. And we're seeing the results of that. And I hope we don't make that mistake again.
So that teased me up well. I think Roger set the tone for this full day last night with his, I thought was really powerful, the reference, the quote from President Reagan. Yeah. And I think about the work we do at the Institute with Governor Hunt and the idea of bringing people together. This is by design that we have a Republican and a Democrat sitting here talking to you about this. So talk to me about how you two have built coalitions across party lines, because what we're dealing with on university campuses, they're coming to neighborhoods near our K-12 schools soon. Yeah.
That's a good point.
They will be in school parking lots. They will be at Friday night football games. You will see these things manifest if we don't help our young people build these bridges. But if our political leaders aren't modeling this, talk to me about how you are leading, how you're modeling, and how you're bringing folks from the other side of the aisle across the line to help advance something that is, because you've talked about a bunch of things you guys have done in a bipartisan way. How have you done it? And we'll let this be your sort of closing reflection, because I know we're going to get a time check somewhere here soon. Well, so Governor Crouch.
First of all, you have to, excuse me, understand and appreciate and believe that elections are for you know, the partisanship. And then once the elections are over, you're for the people.
Right.
And you have to work together. And so if you don't if you don't have that kind of thought process, you're not going to be able to reach across the aisle, and you're not going to be able to get things done. And so, you know, it's something that I started in local government, I'm in state government, I've been in the executive branch, I've been in the legislative branch, I'm president of the Senate, and the ability to work together is what I'm most proud of. It's how I think we accomplish good legislation. Otherwise, we're accomplishing legislation that just takes care of some people. And we're here to take care of all the people. And so I think it really becomes a personal philosophy. And it takes leaders that really embrace that to make it happen.
So what I will say is I think Governor Beshear has done a phenomenal job in Kentucky of really bringing the temperature down. I know we hear that a lot, but being able to have conversations with people that you may or may not agree with and doing it in a way that, again, allows you to come back to the table. But I think the most important decision we made was when we first filed to run for office, we said we wholly reject culture wars. We're not talking about it. We're not dealing with it. We're here to create jobs and make the education system better and make sure people have health care, right? Build bridges and roads. That's our job. Now, there are some folks who operate in, they wouldn't know what to do if there wasn't a culture war this week, right? And while that may be part of the conversation and that may be what people do to drum up interest or you know, get attention, we have wholly rejected that. And what we saw was we won in 2019 by 1.5 votes per precinct across the state of Kentucky. And in 2023, we were reelected with a 5-point margin in a state that elected the last Republican president by 20-something points. So by all intents and purposes, that's the landslide in Kentucky. And so, right, and so I think that was the reward that the people of Kentucky said, we want more, we want you to get more things done. We want you to focus on the things that we worry about every night when we lay our heads down and not talk about the things that are on cable news all the time. They hear enough of that, right? And so we've really worked hard to reject those conversations and instead focus on the things that we know our families care about. And I have to tell you that it has been the biggest relief to do that, because I think about when we go to our National Lieutenant Governors Association meetings, we have our partisan meetings the night before, and then we come together at with everybody, and we learn so much from each other. I mean, we all talk about the things that we're working on, and we say, well, how did you do that? We want to figure out how to make that happen in our state. But ultimately, when it comes to that first partisan meeting that we have, I'm hearing all my colleagues from across the state, they have to talk about their state politics, and then they, of course, throw in something about the presidential candidates, and I'm like, God, that must be exhausting. And I'm so glad we don't do that, because you really do get to focus on the things right in front of you. I can't do anything about a lot of the stuff that is part of those culture wars that keep getting brought up, but I can help your kids' classrooms be better resourced. I can help make sure that your family has health care. I can make sure that that bridge from northern Kentucky into Cincinnati gets built. And so those are the things that we're squarely focused on. And when we do have conversations where we disagree, we really try to do it in a way where we can say, okay, we don't see eye to eye, let's reconvene later.
Well, please join me in a nice round of applause for Governor Coleman, Governor Couch. And